Good evening, everyone. For those of you who are here with us in person and for all of you who are with us on our Facebook Live and YouTube channels, welcome to Asia Society Museum. My name is Michelle Yun Mapplethorpe, and I'm Vice President for Global Artistic Programs and Director of the Asia Society Museum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues in the Diaspora, a conversation with artists Bahar Behbahani and Farsad Labbauf about their respective practices and their experiences working in the diaspora. This exhibition has been organized in conjunction with our recent exhibition, Rebel, Jester, Mystic, Poet, Contemporary Persians from the Mohammad Afkhami Collection, which was on view through May 8th. And it was curated by Dr. Fareshta Daftari. If you were not able to see the show while it was up, I encourage you to check out the archive on our exhibition website. There's images, related programs, archives, and then also a virtual tour that you can see the works that were on view. And these are all accessible on our website. So looking ahead, before we start our program this evening, I'm very pleased to share that we'll be hosting two wonderful exhibitions this summer that will open on June 15th. The first exhibition is called Mirror Image, A Transformation of Chinese Identity, which is guest curated by Barbara Pollock, and it presents the work of 7 contemporary artists from mainland China who are all born after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976. And so it's the first time that, this generation of artists who were all born as part of the one-child policy is living in this kind of new China and a globalized society. And so it's really charting the cultural, political, and social economic changes that are going on in the country since the end of the Cultural Revolution. So I encourage you to check that out. And then we also have Visionary Legacies, a tribute to Harold J. Newman. And for those of you who are not familiar, Hal, as we like to call him, Newman, was a beloved trustee and great champion of the museum who passed away earlier this year. And he and his wife, Ruth, were instrumental in founding our contemporary art collection in 2007. And we were the wonderful beneficiaries of a number of wonderful acquisitions gifted by them. So this exhibition will be a tribute to Mr. Newman's legacy of building our contemporary collection, his great support of Asian arts and culture. So I hope that you'll be able to see both of these shows. So I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank all of you members, both that are here in the building and then many of you who are watching virtually. As you know, the pandemic has been made it a very challenging time for institutions, and so your support during this critical and challenging time has been so appreciated, and we couldn't have continued our work without your support. So thank you so much. And for those of you who are not members, I encourage you to get involved. We have a wonderful program of live and virtual events and exhibitions, wonderful performances, and other interdisciplinary initiatives. So please come see what we're all about. So back to the program this evening. So the structure of the program will be that I'll ask the two artists to come and each give a 15-minute presentation about their work. We'll start with Bahar, and then Farsad will come up directly following. And after their presentations conclude, I'll come on the stage to join them for a 45-minute moderated conversation, after which we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. So for those of you who are joining us virtually, if you would please submit your questions on whichever platform, Facebook or YouTube. My colleagues will be sending me your questions through my phone, and so I can address those to the artists at that time. So it's now my honor to introduce our guest speakers this evening. First, I will be speaking about Bahar Behbahani, who is a painter, collaborator, educator, and a hospitable instigator. She was born and raised in Iran and currently lives and works in New York City. Behbahani's multi-layered work explores the complexities of memory, loss, adaptation, and a fundamental search for a sense of place. The artist's community-oriented installation, I Can Drink Stars, was featured in the 2019 Lahore Biennale and was subsequently installed as public art in Lahore, Pakistan. Her solo exhibition, Let the Garden Aram Flourish, was presented at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth College in 2017. Her multidisciplinary series, Garden Coup, has been shown at the Thomas Urban Gallery in New York and the Shanghai Biennale in 2016. Behbahani's work has also been featured in the Moscow Biennale in 2017, the Sydney Biennale in 2012, the Sharjah Biennale in 2011, and at the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum at the Michigan State University and the Tribeca Film Festival, among many other venues. Behbahani has received a Creative Capital Award in 2019 and the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant in 2020. We had the privilege of collaborating with Bahar this spring on a wonderful commission, Mother River, that I encourage you to check out online on our website. So our second speaker this evening is Farsad Labbauf. He's a multidisciplinary Iranian artist living and working in the New York area. Best known for his linear figurative paintings, Labbauf immigrated to the United States at the age of 13. He received his Bachelor of Fine Arts, followed by a second degree in industrial design from the Rhode Island School of Design. The origins of Labbauf's work lie in figurative expressionism, a style he practiced for more than 2 decades, leading to the creation of his linear figurative style. His paintings, as well as his ongoing sewing series, are inspired by studies in quantum physics and a reverence for ideas of unity and monism. Labbauf began exploring these ideas during his first visit back to his native country of Iran after 22 years ago. His works have been featured in more than 60 group shows across the globe at venues such as Ex Aron, Pescara, Italy, Jersey City Museum, New Jersey, the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art in New York, and the Saatchi Gallery in London. Additionally, he's had solo exhibitions in Amsterdam, Boston, New York, and Tehran. Labbauf's works can be found in numerous public and private collections, including the Karsten de Boer Collection, the Lee Sang-bong Collection, Mohammed Afkhami Collection, the Newark Museum of Art, Saatchi Gallery, and the Salsali Private Museum, among others. His work is currently represented by Roya Khadavi Projects in New York and Etimet Gallery in Tehran. And we're very privileged to have Roya Khadavi here this evening with us. Thank you, Roya, for being instrumental in making this conversation possible. It's a wonderful collaboration. So, on to the exciting part of the program. Please join me in welcoming Bahar Behbahani to the stage for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess this is a little bit high, maybe. I and I need to put the timer on. And I guess I'm allowed to have my mask off. So let's start it. Thank you so much, Michelle, for the wonderful introduction. Thanks all for coming. This is really exciting to have people in person. It's very intimate and intimidating at the same time. But we're going to go through it. So I was thinking a lot that what should I share today in 15 minutes under the umbrella of Dialogues in Diaspora, which is a huge theme. So this is me. Sorry, I forgot to bring my stool today. So I hope you see me well. But I have a very multidisciplinary practice. Although I'm trained as a painter, but I do make videos and installations, and recently I do a lot of public art, which I can call them like more community-oriented public art, and I'm hoping like in the next 15 minutes I can talk about why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. And it was actually, I have to thank you and Asia Society and the team that made this opportunity to a little bit think about it and reflect on, like, pause and think about, like, why am I doing these things and how everything started from the beginning. So it's sometimes good to pause on that. So I usually don't show actually any of my old works, but in the process of thinking, who am I that I'm standing here today, and how I really shifted my practice naturally, some of it consciously, some of it subconsciously. It started all here, which, as you may see, I'm upside down. So it was, I think it's like really good to start with this work. It's from 2007. It's the year that I consider it as the year that I actually adopted New York City as a second home, if I can call it. So it's an epoch in my work, in my projects, in part of like who I am. This work was a video, 7 minutes video, and was called Suspended. And I think through that, it started in a very, very personal, people read it as like an autobiography. I absolutely felt upside down. So this is my own backyard back in Tehran. So when I got back in Iran after a couple of years of traveling or staying, I don't call it migrating at that time because it wasn't what I meant to do. So when I got back to my own backyard, which I'm hoping that through this talk I can talk about like the role of the garden in my work as well, and the private place, private garden and public garden as well. I really felt upside down, and I think why not to translate it with my own body. And I did it as a performance work, which actually wasn't for anybody because we don't do these things. At least at that time, we didn't have like an opportunity to have like performance like that. So I just made a film out of it and a series of photographies. So the reason that I'm bringing this, because from there, I can also just fast forward to right now and the thing that I've been doing for the last decades, and it's related very much to gardens and garden imagery and plants and the horticultural lexicon and water system, water infrastructure. And usually they are coming from what I know, which is Persian garden. And for those who are here, mostly I see like Iranian audience here. Persian garden, of course, has got like a very cultural weight, and there is no reason to even talk about it with each other because we live in it, even though we don't have garden, but it's just the way of being. So that's like the cultural aspect of Persian garden. But also like to talk about it, that why Persian garden, and when we talk about Persian garden, what is important for me. This is a Persian garden aerial view from above. It's in south of Iran, Shazde Kerman. And this is a picture that usually I bring up in my talks, and it's also like I have it in my studio on the wall because it really like makes me grounded. And when we talk about like Persian garden, it's good to know like what geography we're talking about. And when we're talking about Persian garden, we're talking about labor. We're talking about craft. We're talking about a very intricate water system. We're talking about like 600 BC when the first water irrigation actually was made by Iranians and Persians. So we're talking about ancestral wisdom, right? And we're talking about like the whole integrity and dignity that goes through this work to bring water from miles away to make this oasis in the middle of nowhere. We're talking about colonialism relationship. We're talking about Orientalism. We're talking about like land accessibility, water accessibility. When we're talking about Persian garden, we're talking about the relationship of urban and rural relationship. We're talking about, I guess, individual and public health. So when we're talking about Persian garden, it's a geopolitics aspect of it. It's about like who made it romanticized and what it means for Europeans, what it means for Western people, what it means for Americans. And I really like to talk about Persian gardens more than my work because I love to, I actually have like a lot of talks and conferences because I've been formally and informally exploring the idea of Persian gardens as a poetics and politics phenomenon in the world, and how particularly plays a political role when it comes to the international political affairs. So I just keep that for another conference that hopefully maybe Asia Society will bring it up. It's also, it's in our miniature painting, it's in our poetry, and it's also, as I said, it's very political, and I can't go with this short time to go like very detailed at how, but this series is Garden Coup. Series is my paintings that is related to this American scholar, Donald Wilbur, who was in Princeton, and I was, when I was in university, I was studying him. And then here, when I got back to him and just studied, he was the scholar of Persian gardens. So many of us back in Iran even just learn Persian gardens and architectures through him, an American guy, which is ironic. And in 2013, I found out that he was the CIA agent as well. And the Persian garden, actually, it was a cover for his job, which was in CIA. And not only that, but also he was a very important figure in happening of the Iranian coup, 1953 coup, that the Americans and British orchestrated for the nationalizing oil that Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to go through, and they ousted him. So this is the series that I've done. It's a very interdisciplinary piece, and I'm still doing it because it's something that is coming back. It's not the history that is about past. It's just constantly getting himself like as a new thing. The Persian garden is also my mother for me, a root. I remember like once I asked my mom, because I did like a lot of research about like the garden, and I asked my mother, Mom, I have like this exhibition, and I just went through like the research as like a PhD thing. I'm getting crazy. Can you just maybe say something to me, a fact about Persian garden? I wanted to make like something personal, like from like someone from family. And then she said, a fact. I'm like, yeah, you have a fact about Persian garden. And she said, your father was calling me Garden of Eden. Like, Perfect. Thank you for this fact. So when she came to America a couple of years ago, she was waiting for her status. It was a Trump time era. And she was, for spending, passing the time, she was crocheting a lot. And while she was crocheting, I was drawing. And at some point, I realized that we are doing the same thing. And I started this series that is called Immigrant Flora. And this is the piece that we made. It's a site-specific installation with my drawing and hair crochet, which I expanded later on. Actually, last year, I did it in Ursinus College in Pennsylvania. Under the name of Immigrant Flora, I expanded the notion of how our horticultural lexicon, particularly in the West and in America, is really affecting the culture and culture of immigrants. And the very simple example of it is when we call things native, non-native, and invasive plants and how they are associated sometimes. So I've been doing like a lot of projects that I'm bringing many other collaborators and community members, and I'm asking like, what is native plants for them? And that is something that this actually ended up with a huge mural within the Behrman Museum that I brought like other issues around the commerce of the plants and the export import, the Silk Road, the lapis lazuli that comes from Afghanistan, and how I made the whole mural with the lapis lazuli, and we were working with the students and the faculties that they weren't like from art department, they were from other disciplines to just talk about these issues. And this is the Behrman Museum. This is actually very important that at the end it was, this piece is in the museum, and it was part of the ecosystem of Ursinus and of Pennsylvania, but was talking about other native plants, which was like also turmeric and other plants from South Asia or like other part of the world. So I'm pushing like the idea that what is these notions about native, global, transnational, transcultural, and how we can just really like interplay with all these. And as you see, like my feet is on the ground, so it seems like I'm not that upside down anymore. And I think the reason that I'm more, my feet more on the ground now, because I think I've found kind of like the solution for myself working within the community. And when I'm talking about community, a very particular community, I like to work with marginalized community, with people of color, with the immigrants. And I'm talking more and more about the stories that they are invisible. And in this particular work, it was in the Bronx at the Wave Hill Garden, where I was asked to work around Hudson River. And speaking about river, because the work that I also did for Asia Society is about 8 rivers. And I like to expand this in our conversation because we don't have that much time here, that how I see that rivers are connected with each other, how the rivers that they separate us, they also connect us. And when they ask me to work about Hudson River, I actually thought about like how much I have memory from Hudson River. And I found out that I don't have any memory from Hudson River. So I have to go to the community and ask what's their memory. And from there, I found out that nobody had memory from Hudson River. And then I realized that everybody came from another river. So the whole project ended up to be about 8 rivers that I thought like we are all connected. My time is ticking, so I just saying that All Water Has a Perfect Memory was the title of the work that is drawn from Toni Morrison's essay. We can also talk about like this piece that I expanded in Lahore. It's again about the politics and the spiritual weight of the river, Ravi River, who India and Pakistan, they share this river, part of Indus River, that is also like it's part of my Asia Society mother river, if you just look at it. So that's another collaboration that I like to expand the ideas in our conversation, that how something hyper-local can be transnational and can be global, and how we can just play back and forth between these, and how we can give the voice to the local artisans, to the local scientists, to the local researchers, and to the local people. And what I have practiced in the last years, which I also, again, like to hear from you, dear Michelle and Farsad, and talk about that, is like how I a little bit reduce the hierarchy aspect of being an artist and just see like how we can work in a rhizomatic way, from the research to the execution to the community-oriented work. And this is the piece that eventually got in Lahore, and it was in collaboration actually with the irrigation department in Punjab, which it was the ultimate challenge because I was working with government, with the engineers, and with artisans, and in a place that it's got its own challenges. So we can talk about it later. This work that I hopefully, I'm hoping that you go online and then you look at them. Mother River, again, it's about a series of rivers that I actually was thinking that how can I make a work that during the pandemic it still can be something for the community, but we can't come in person together, unlike today that I'm happy that I'm here. But this work came to birth when I thought, so we can just meditate on some rivers, and the idea of like tributing to some rivers that they are affected by coal mining. And each river has is 1 minute, and it was really a joyful and thoughtful and mindful collaboration with musicians and with Magic Shaybal, who wrote the music for each piece in a way that he responded to the way that I draw, and I monoprinted and I make the rivers videos. And the theater artist Tara Ahmadinejad, who had a voiceover with these poetries that we all came together. These are 8 female poets. That is also, we can talk about it later. Now I want to invite you and end my talk to watch 1 minute and meditate on Rancheria River in Colombia. Thank you.
Come in, Rio Rancheria. Welcome. What's the weather today? The sea in the night, that part which the lights outside the dome make clear, is warm, warmer than the air, and the water becomes something other than water.
Hello, everyone. I'm Farsad. Before I start, bravo, Baharjan, for that powerful presentation. And my gratitude to Michelle Yoon from Asia Society, as well as Roya Khajavi for organizing this program. I want to go a little bit, even though Michelle read our biographies, I would like to go a little bit back in time before I start my work, to talk about my work, excuse me. I was born in Tehran and lived there for about 13 years, the first 13 years of my life. Had started painting in Iran and continued doing that, as well as making sculptures during my time in Rhode Island School of Design, where I studied industrial design as well as fine arts. Now, for a period of about 13 years, up until around the year 2000, most of my work was primarily focused on expressionism. Very raw, very emotive. I used art as a method of catharsis and really believed in that style. Produced a volume of about 300 to 350 works, mostly on canvas and paper. However, this sculpture that you see here is made of melted plastic tubes that I had intertwined and painted. It was suspended from the ceiling of a gallery in Boston in '91, where I had one of my first exhibitions in Boston. Because of our time limitations, this is the only image I'm going to show you from that period. The rest of my work is going to start around the year 2000. Now, towards the end of 1990s, several shifts started to occur both in my personal life as well as my work, which have often been very intertwined. I was becoming more and more aware of transience, how our emotions are often, if not always, controlled by our perception. So the idea of contemplation became more important than solely expressing emotions. It's around that time, I was also doing some minor studies in quantum physics, as well as monistic belief systems. So now we go to the year 2000. Excuse me. One of my first trips to Iran. My parents had brought my sister and I to the US in 1979 in the middle of the Iranian Revolution because our education was interrupted. They were hoping we would return soon, but it wasn't for another 17 years. My mother had kept both our bedrooms intact, exactly as we had left it, frozen in time. All the contents in the drawers of my desk, the closet, even the calendar page on the wall were exactly the same. Of course, I was very touched, but I also felt this deep sense of disconnect, if you will. I think it's a sense of disconnect that's born within every immigrant once they return home. They disconnect with the vacuum of time, with the culture that I was raised in versus my native land of Iran. So to kind of make peace with that, I started to pull out the materials from the drawers and just sit with them. Childhood drawings, images from school books, postcards, and cut them apart. Just cut them apart into pieces, meditate on some of the subjects, and reassemble them through the sewing process. It was more of a physical act, if you will, a ritual. In retrospect, perhaps it was a metaphor for my body being torn away from the land. I was making these without really much formal concern for precision. Like I said, it was the act that was more important than the end product. Moving content around, cut out some images and worked with some of the materials I had also brought back with me from the West, airline magazines, brochures. So this grew to be a series of 7 pieces, that were all made during that trip. Now, returning back to New York, where my studio was, I continued making more of these sewing collages using found images, mostly from magazines. Most of my the images were from magazines. I was assembling them, but I was also exploring different means of connection. I was using sewing. My studio was on West 38th Street in the Garment District of New York, so I had great access to different sewing supplies, different size needles, embroidery floss, threads, but also exploring, like I said, different means of connecting. In this particular piece, there is some sewing, but I had also used staples, safety pins, if I recall correctly, and some ribbons to make one whole unit out of all these images. It was a great time of exploration. I was sewing different things together, like chunks of paint to the canvas. This piece is called 38 Feet. I think it's from 2003, if I recall correctly again. I was putting out my trash night after night and observed that it had become like a diary. So I started sewing 38 feet of it together to explore my relationship with time and its passage as a line. It's a detail. This piece was called the Zip Tie Project, where I explored random connectivity and its relationship to organic growth patterns. It was an installation on the wall of the Jersey City Museum. Even worked on a series of weavings as an assembly method. This is from a series of 5 pieces. This particular one is connected through using band-aids on the vertical format. I'm not sure if it's very clear from the image, but I had a problem with that. The idea of anything using glue suggested too much permanence. I wanted a liquid process, something that offered transience. So returned to using the needle and the thread and sewing. It's a page of a magazine that I had painted over, cut into small squares, and sewed together to create this kind of liquid, loose image through a grid system, again, a loose grid system in the center. At that point, I had been using photography as a means of exploration, photographing different subjects around me, statues, self-portraits. So it was a natural progression to start creating my own source material. First using C-prints and sewing them to different, mostly paper backgrounds. But I wanted the work to have some kind of support, a strong support. So experimented with connecting the threads to push pins that were attached to a painted plywood background. So basically the image is held together by the force of the pull of the different strings on all edges around the photograph. And then I started connecting them onto stretched canvases that I would paint in advance and experiment with different backgrounds. As for the prints themselves, I started using archival inkjet prints with very matte finishes. To give you an idea of scale, this is about 78 by 34 inches. Worked on a series of self-portraits at the same time, exploring issues of identity, imagining and reimagining oneself before the age of selfie. So it's around this time that I visited Centrale Montemartini, the first electric plant in Rome, which was housing a large collection of classical statues from the Capitoline Museum. Photographed a number of the statues in parts, and when I came back to New York in my studio, started assembling them in the same manner. This is Fortunoish Dei, or the goddess of good fortune. And that is Jupiter. All assembled the same way. The canvas was painted in advance, and the lines are very spontaneous. The sewing is spontaneous. Now, this series remained incomplete. I captured all the images in 2001, but did not complete the series until 2020. The pandemic was actually a great opportunity to return and complete these works. This is the first piece I assembled after that gap of time. It's the study of the warrior, or I like to call it half warrior. As you see, the colors have become more vibrant, reflecting my painting palette of the time. Now, because of our time concerns, I'm not going to get into too much detail about the relationship between the sewing patterns and their subjects, but I will mention some notes. The radial bursts on some of these are partially inspired by the Roman sun god, Sol Invictus. This is a statue of Aristogiton, the tyrannicide who became the preeminent symbol of democracy for the ancient Athenians. And here we have the full warrior, which was a study in volume and space, both literally and metaphorically. The remains of the statue of Orpheus, the Greek legend, poet, prophet, musician, who was legendary for his music. He charmed all beings, including inanimate objects like stones. So I'm not sure if it's very clear in the image, but the central sewing pattern is loosely inspired by musical sound waves. I also photographed a few statues from the former Parish Art Museum's Arboretum, which is now the Southampton Art Center. These are the dancing naiads made by American sculptor Walker Hancock. As well as Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, from the same garden. And a portrait of a friend of mine from 2003, Amir. Now, as far as the subject matter, you might have noticed most of the images were of male subjects. In making them, I found a sense of equilibrium using the sewing process, which is often associated with the feminine. Now, quickly on to some notes on paintings. Again, I'm going to start only from the year 2000 and move forward as samples. A lot of these, that was one of the more completed series that I'm showing you. On the paintings, I had to really, like Bahar did, make hard selections just to show samples of the process during the span of 2 decades. So lines had started entering my work as early as 2001, around the same time as the first sewings. I was using them to connect the different areas of the canvas together. As well as some of the content on the canvas. But decided to let go of the grid, to use more fluid lines and create organically layered compositions. I wanted to build a vocabulary or a visual language to communicate some of the ideas I was contemplating, regardless of the subject matter of the painting. Ideas such as singularity or being in a state of flux. So many, many more lines started entering the painting to connect the different geographies of the surface. This is about 6 feet by 6 feet. It's a series of 3 different paintings. This is only one of them. Again, from early 2000s, 2004, I believe. But just like the sewings, I decided to reduce my content, to just focus on building this language. So in addition to that, I also reduced the layering of the lines. The reason for that being, I wanted a see-through subject. I wanted the space around him, behind him, and the front to be integrated into the actual subject, hence merging the foreground with the background. These are only 2 examples of those earlier, smaller portraits. You can see in the lines the history of my expressionism. They're very raw. So for a period of, just to focus and build that language, for a period of 10 years, I only painted portraits. Gradually refined the lines and even broke them down into tiny little pieces that I like to call particles, studying light and shadow as well as color. These are oil on canvas. I wanted to create an image that was in a state of flux, somewhere between completion and dissolution, to convey this idea of transience that I talked about earlier. Some of these are quite large. This is about 88 by 112 inches. And they were all oil on canvas. Took about 1.5 years to paint. I believe this one's 106 by 77 inches. And a portrait of my father, Baba, is 96 by 77 inches. I think the next image will show you a better visual of scale. This is from an exhibition at Aran Gallery in Tehran from 2010. So to 2016, when I started to introduce other content in my work. Of course, we have Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, in the forefront. There's the outline of his captain in the submarine in between, right behind him. And behind the outline is a figure of Bugs, whose famous line is, of course, you know this means war. So as a child growing up in Iran in the 70s, our lives were very much filled with images from the West. Comic strips, films, cartoons. I started to play with some of these childhood mythologies and their influence on building identity, both on a personal level as well as collective level. So of course here we have modern day deity superhero Batman with an Elizabethan ruff, and his juxtaposed against the outline of a female figure on the left-hand side, extracted from the painter, Iranian master miniature painter Behzad. This became a series, and this is from the same, it's called Of Shireen and Superheroes, #2. She's painted on the right-hand side with very thin lines. Same theme follows in this work. It's a diptych. It's called From Well to Well. And you have the small silhouette of an oil rig on the lower left-hand side of the left panel. And don't have the English word for it, but for aftabe on the upper right-hand side. In addition to the Western fictional figures, I started using images from the life of one of Iran's real superheroes, Dr. Mossadegh. You have his dissolving portrait on the right-hand side, and the thin lines that you see are extracted from a photograph of his removal from court on the day of his conviction. Same subject continues into this work, focusing on Operation Ajax and his removal from office that Bahar mentioned. And two last works. This is from 2020, when I started to use straight lines to construct some of the figures. It's a self-portrait on a partial map of Iran with masks floating down. And on the lower right-hand side, you have the outline of a Disney figure I grew up with, who appears in this last work. All truth is not created equal. Snow White contemplating death of Bluebird in front of BP's mandala. And of note on this particular work is, if you blur your eyes, or the more distant you get from the actual work, she becomes real. But the closer you get to the physical painting, the Disney myth falls apart. So, thank you.
Work. 2 points that really kind of jumped out at me listening to you both is this idea of connection and transience. And I think that's a confluence of both of your practices that maybe we can use as a jumping off point. Thinking about the idea of connection with rivers from your perspective, Bahar, and then with sewing and string, and this idea also with both of these, of this idea of transience and impermanence. So as the river is flowing, it's constantly shifting and morphing, and so it's not static. And then with your idea of not wanting too much of permanence in your collage work, you know, thinking about the string that can be very malleable depending on how taut or loose you want to pull it and how you want to manipulate it. So maybe if we could start with these two ideas of connection and transience, we could elaborate a little bit and see how we can come together.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Okay.
Well, actually, are microphones working?
Yes,
I
they are.
think
They
so.
are. They are.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it. I think for me it's really important to make this kind of sense of kinship with not only the people and the community, but also us and nature, and also other species together. So I'm constantly, I guess, longing for some sort of kinship. So everything that I do is not because I know what I'm doing. It's mostly because I'm looking for kind of like a solution. It's when we're talking about like climate, when we're talking about environmental justice, when we're talking about like climate exile, all these is just moving, right? We're talking about like how everybody is just moving for something else. And I think maybe as a visual artist first, because it's my identity, I'm always thinking like, what is the solution that I can make this not only more visible, but more translatable, and some sort of like making a space to hold that space for everybody to come and just talk about these things. So that aspect of, again, like this kinship that is only comes, I think it only can come when the works are not complete. Because when you offer something that you as an artist think is complete, I feel like you already just closed the conversation.
Do you really feel that way, though? Do you feel that? Because for me, I feel like the paintings never end. Maybe it's my obsessiveness, but as far as just painting, the process itself, do you feel a finality? I'm curious.
I don't want to finish anything, because I think if I don't finish, people and other species also, they all can come and just contribute something.
Okay.
So I think that's why maybe even like as a painter, I have a little bit problematic relationship with my own as a painter, because when we say it ends, it was something that we got trained, and what we call it today as the contemporary way that of being in the injustice, climate, and all these catastrophic things. I kind of like, not only I don't know how to finish things, but also I don't think that's the solution. And sometimes I feel like, who am I to finish an idea and put there and just say like, this is it, just come and see. So I'm in this transition, and that's why maybe I'm just more and more in a more fluid way of working and collaborating and bringing others to bring their own ideas as well. Yeah.
And for both of you, because you are both diasporic artists, you know, based in New York, and there are definitely affinities through your art making practices of tapping into your cultural roots, tapping into the rich history of Iran, both, you know, formally through the arts, but also its socio-political history. And I wonder if this idea of kind of transience and kind of this wanting to leave things open, and also kind of this this dialogue between the individual and the self and the collective or the community, you know, how does that relate to your own personal experiences of kind of being other, being in this third space. I would be curious to hear how that then translates through kind of how you were both describing both your working process, but also your subject matter and how your work, becomes manifest in a visceral way.
As far as the shift in the environment, you mean as an immigrant? Is that?
Perhaps, yes. I mean, just this idea of kind of being transplanted in a place, whether it's by your design or not.
I like that, transplanted.
Yes. Gosh. Well, I reflect on that, but also on your earlier points about connection. They're all connected.
Yes, I mean, I think it's kind of interrelated, yes. the
Very
two
much
questions.
So. I think, I speak for myself, Bahar, please interject, or just being disconnected has probably made me very much aware of connections. It's just we often become conscious of the opposite of what is happening. And that in itself, the investigation, the process of it, and not only the conscious awareness, but the process both in the work and in life, contributes to the work, certainly. Certainly. Just this, for every immigrant, I don't think it's particular, obviously, for us.
Sure, of course.
I'm not sure if it ever is complete is not the right word, settled. It's just something you live with and you accept and you adapt. Sometimes to survive and sometimes just naturally in an organic manner. And it certainly reflects in the work. I was thinking about your work and the gardens, the Persian gardens. I wonder how much of it is about roots and being uprooted. When you were talking about that, it does become very emotional and very personal on so many levels.
Well, also this idea of the garden as an oasis, and also thinking about memory as an oasis, right? I mean, that was a connection that I was making between both of your practices, like using this idea, again, thinking on very many different levels. I mean, I loved, Bahar, how you were thinking about the history of gardens, not just as an aesthetic kind of, botanistic, focus, but thinking about the engineering, thinking about what I think you said, ancestral wisdom, right? Thinking about making connections and thinking about different types of being, whether urban or rural or kind of disparity or prosperity, right? And thinking about this idea of an oasis, a physical oasis, but also a mental or emotional, psychological oasis. And then when we were looking at the collages after you returned to your family's house after 22 years, or 22 years ago, sorry, I made that same error. But, after 17 years of being away, having these box of memories, or just having this oasis of your past that your mother just kind of hermetically sealed, in this time capsule. And so just thinking about those as touchstones for not only your artistic practice, but also your spiritual life or, existence, I think is really profound, that I noticed between your works.
I think for me is oasis and working with Persian gardens and this idea and kind of make the Persian garden as a rubric for myself to just talk about like other issues. It just came out of like urgency. Like it, maybe like in 2007 when I showed you in my own backyard, in my own like environmental geography orientation, it was different. I used my body as kind of like a schema to just find this orientation there. But later on, I felt the urgency of talking about these oasis that is actually in the West. It's got like only that kind of relationship with that. And for me, it's just really critical and important to emphasize and explore and learn every day that this is actually the ecological solution that our ancestors, they found it, and then we ignored it, and not only ignored it, but also through like many political relationship, it got also invisible or repressed or ruined. Even I don't go through like the how, even like something like the sanctions can just ruin these ancient wisdom of system of water because of the infrastructure goes under the threat, right? So we're not only talking about like a culture of a nation and a culture of a world going under threatened, but also we're not like using this for maybe a solution for the future for the climate, because these Islamic or Persian ecological system, they are the very wise climate-wise, they are important to pay attention, to learn from it, and to see like how we can all come together. Like living in New York, for me, the land of Lenape people, it's also like another aspect of like how we are ignorant about like another giant, big ancestors that they knew how to treat the land and water. And so I think it's a matter of really urgency. Like it's for me, because I know Persian garden, I call it Persian garden, but like through that, I really want to bring other people to just be together and you know, find other solutions for living today.
Well, I think that's an interesting segue for both of you. I mean, you know, I think that both of you are using at different points in your practices, you know, very culturally specific points of reference, but using it as a segue or a point of entry into a more universal idea of connection. And I wonder, you know, that's something that we are always mindful of at Asia Society. You know, we are focusing on the, you know, broad region of Asia and also the diaspora, but, you know, and for audiences that are probably most likely not as familiar with those specific cultures or the specificities or nuances. I mean, and that's part, you know, that's a major mission for us, is to educate and to bring light to, you know, the wondrous aspects of these cultures. But I think it's also a challenge, because how do you really, in a thoughtful way, show those nuances, or, you know, how can you really speak meaningfully to audiences who don't know the cultural specificities? And I wonder, because both of you use aspects of that in your work, how do you deal with that kind of transposition maybe of, you know, using something that might be more culturally specific and then opening it up so that there's a more broad understanding? Or is that important? Is that not as much of a priority, and it's more just for your personal connection and in the imagery that it can, you know, open up?
To speak to a larger audience, I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for example, you know, I would say that probably most Americans are not so familiar with the history of Persian gardens, for example. But if you were in Iran, it would probably be, you know, a much different understanding. So just thinking kind of cross-culturally with both of the kind of, you know, more cultural specificities that you're bringing into your work, how do you feel that you need to interpret that in a different way, being in New York or being in the West, rather than being in Iran or in the Middle East or in Europe, for example, or, you know, as a counterpoint, or, you know, you were in Lahore. So how does your work translate transculturally, and do you feel that there are different nuances and emphases, and does that matter, or can it exist as it is?
You want to go?
I don't start from there. It does matter, but I think if you focus on, sometimes for me, again, mostly with paintings, on the formal aspects of the work, of course the subject matter does matter, but the integration of both the elements of the content as well as, for example, the color or the way it's made, I think that personally, the goal for me is to reach out outside of a present audience, to travel in time, hopefully. Even though the content is matter, again, this is specifically in reference to my own work, content does matter, but I would like the work to be able to speak to bigger truths, if you will, than specific problems in time or in history. So even though I do use the theme of Dr. Mossadegh and his removal from office in '53 by the CIA in England, I would like the work to speak outside of that to a bigger truth in time. Even the portraits, to me, they're not just portraits. They're about a moment in time, an existence outside of the geography of Iran or the subject matter of who I actually painted. Again, that's in reference to my own work. So, Bahar?
Yeah, I think maybe there is a reason they called me a hospitable instigator. For me, is the most important is like making something that is inviting. That is inviting. The beauty is really important for me. So I go from there. I start from there. And the rest is really just depends on how we interact with each other, how much we are open to other ideas, how much I make the environment ready and, again, more inviting to be able to open up other issues or other. And also, like, my work is easier because everybody knows plants. So I don't care if nobody knows about like Persian gardens. I speak plants. And I think everybody just has got some sort of, experience with plants. And then from there, I go through like other issues, if either like political or like socially problematic or things that they are critical for me. Something else that came to my mind is like being Iranian, not necessarily always going back to a very particular characteristic or a tradition that is so obvious or manifesting in some sort of embodying in like a physicality of it. But like I think like being poetic, being ambiguous is being Iranian. And that's kind of like a universal thing. Although my own partner sometimes will say, I don't understand you, what language you speak. Oh, poetry. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. That's just the way that politely he wants to say you don't speak English that I know of. But what I'm saying is like a culture that is embedded in like everything else, the language, the way you think, the way you interact, the way you even move your body, the behavioral, aspect of carrying yourself and water and flower and things. This is poetry. So I think for me it's just like less deliberate than like how I use a color or how I use a form than just like the way I brought up very poetically. So I can't help it, right? So yeah, so
sensibility, right?
Yeah,
right.
And I think if again, like for me, I go from beauty, I go from inviting, and then from there, we start a conversation. If it's needed.
Do you contribute that to being an artist? Because from what you're saying, I mean, it really resonates, but I contribute that more to my identity as an artist versus being, I mean, we do have a very poetic language, and it's such a shame that it's not being preserved better in time and history. But I'm curious how much of that is you being an artist, how much of it is really being Iranian? And I do ask that question from myself. in time. So
I think a little bit difference here for me is because I didn't grow up with this language and because I wasn't brought up in this environment. So I always have this sense of being here but not being here, because I'm living in another language but I'm thinking in another thing and I'm being in another environment. And I'm constantly translating each other to each other, but it's not only about the language, but also the custom. Again, everything that I do, even the brush that I take, I feel like it's not separable from what I knew from myself, the way that I grew up, the manner of consumerism, the manner of we grew up and brought up as artists in Iran, that we only have one kind of brush. These things, they are so imprinted. Mm-hmm. If you grew up in the war during the revolution, it's just, again, it's different. And I think it's a privilege. At least I translated this for myself so I don't get depressed, that this is a privilege, that when I'm standing here, again, exactly it happened to me in the Hudson River example in the Bronx, that I thought, oh, I don't have to really try so hard to see other cultures or other places, geographically, culturally, and physically, because I'm one of those. I'm always from somewhere else, but I'm floating somewhere else. So I'm just between this super local in my immediate surrounding and somewhere else, which is that poetry, So when I'm just talking about the ecology of Hudson River, of course it's important for me because I live in New York, but then for sensing it and giving that sense of urgency of climate also, I have to have some sort of memory of that smell of Hudson, which I don't have it, but I have the memory of Karun River. That's how just I move around. I'm okay, so to understand the Hudson River, I have to refer back to my own Karun River, and then let's just ask this Mexican guy that, okay, so maybe, oh yeah, you have another thing, and then together we make another language, which is not their language, not my language, not this language, but it's a hybrid language, which it makes everything interesting for me. Not only my art, which, as I said, these days, it's kind of a secondary for me to think about, this is art, this is what I'm doing. I'm more thinking of how we can reduce these hierarchy levels of being what. And
and that seems so liberating. It's without boundaries, right? It's really kind of limitless in that way.
We're kind of tired of borders, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's really beautiful. Wonderful. Well, we have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. And let me just check and see if we have any questions from...
Or we can ask some questions from audience.
Sure. Anybody have questions for the artists or thoughts about their work? Well, I would be curious... go ahead, Rachel.
First, I want to thank you both for your generosity and sharing so much. And this wasn't something that you addressed directly, but I'm really curious about the element of science that comes in. You mentioned physics.
Yes.
And you've mentioned solutions several times, and I think talking about climate change. And I'm just wondering, and there's such a creative aspect to science, to how people come up with solutions. So I'm just wondering if there's just your ruminations on the ideas of how that has affected you in your work, and and what that dynamic might be.
It's a great question. Thank you.
I did talk about science earlier. Yes, it did deeply affect my work. Just minor studies again in physics, in particular quantum physics, ideas such as string theory, and learning about that even, and what that does to my perception and how I conceive the world, and how I use that in my work. I mean, it immensely affected my work, I would say. And it is a very creative, broad view of the world, which can be interpreted in many, many different ways. I am just using only one interpretation of that. I think, like Bahar's systems of the water passageways in Iran, Qanat, that we have, those were based on architecture and a lot of history and mathematical. Those are the waterways that connect. I'm not sure what's the English word for it, to irrigation, basically, to an old, ancient, you said 600 years old, is that correct?
It's 600 BC.
600 BC, gosh, yes. So certainly there's a relationship, not only in the poetry of it, but also in the literal mathematical conception of those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. What can I add to this? Definitely, I'm getting more and more interested with collaboration with scientists, biologists, botanists, other disciplines. I think not only just because science can help art or art can help science. I think, again, it's on all these borders that we're trying to, the intersection of all these take us somewhere. So, and that's why I'm more and more, when I'm sitting in my studio, I'm like, no, that's not enough. I have to just bring some others. And in this brainstorming, things just happening for me. And another thing is maybe because I'm not a scientist and nobody in my family, everybody was has been artists. So I'm always like also longing for this relationship with scientists, and I truly believe that we can help each other. And it's been happening through my collaboration in irrigation department in Lahore, but also in Ursinus College, that I particularly work with biologists, environmental study people, and also, you know, all these engineers. We have things for each other from our own angles that is definitely, it's liberating, and it takes us, I guess, to a better place than just this isolated way. I don't believe in any discipline. This kind of like being so expert and a specialist, it's so Western. And again, like in the East and in the old Persia, like they were all together. Like a philosopher was a mathematician. A mathematician was a botanist. Like it was so merging with each other that I think we lost it in the cost of capitalism and becoming the education system and universities and all that. It's another story, but yeah.
Well, I have one final question from somebody online, and so it's for both of you. And so the question is, do you feel an increasing sense of nostalgia for your Persian heritage as you, you know, continue to work in your practice and to you know, continue to live in New York over time?
Absolutely. Outside of, I believe personally, outside of being an artist, I think just traveling through time and being, as time goes by, more and more physically away from the geography and the culture and the language and the Persian garden. Every time she says Persian garden, I think of the smell of hyacinths, which is a plant we use, a flower we use for Nowruz. And it is in my mind, these just, like you said, nuances, intricate details of life. or what we had, for example, which is not common here, gorgeous sabs. They're just how do you
The green plums, I don't know.
Yes, just a taste and different senses that are missing. Of course, I speak again for myself, we are gaining new experiences, but those roots are not necessarily being nourished the same way they were when we were in that environment. So yes, certainly there's a bigger sense of nostalgia, and that reflects in the work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to you both for your generosity of time.
Thank you,
Thank
Michelle.
you.
And for sharing your practices. We're very much looking forward to seeing what you do next and to staying in touch. So thank you, all of you who are with us in person today, and all of you who are online. Please come visit us in person at Asia Society. June 15th is our next exhibition. And check out Bahar and Farsad's new works at Roya Khadavi's gallery. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.